Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The workshop smelled of copper and earth, of things dissolved and reformed. In the year when the old king still drew breath and the new one waited in the wings of power, a girl whose name would rarely be spoken aloud moved between the great vats with the careful grace of someone who has learned early that the world requires attention. Her father's hands were stained, not with sin, as the priest might have suggested in his Sunday sermons, but with the honest discoloration of a tradesman who had spent 30 years coaxing color from roots and minerals, from madder and woad, from the dried shells of insects that traveled in merchant ships from lands no one in the quarter had seen. The dyer's quarter occupied a particular place in Lyon's geography, neither elevated nor debased. It was a place of skilled labor, of guild privileges hard-won and carefully guarded, of respectability that rested on the twin pillars of competence and discretion. The girl, we might call her Marguerite, though in the workshop she was simply referred to as the dyer's daughter, or, when work demanded it, you there, understood this instinctively, the way children understand the invisible boundaries that structure their world. She did not yet have words for such things. She had only the knowledge that arrived through her senses, the weight of expectation in her father's silences, the particular way her mother's voice changed when certain merchants came to negotiate, the careful performance of prosperity that required new linen to be worn on festival days, even when older cloth would have served. Her mother had left the world when the girl was 8 years old, taking with her the warmth that had softened the workshop's edges. The illness had been neither sudden nor surprising. Such things moved through the city with the seasons, and the quarter had seen 3 other women die that winter, their absences noted and absorbed as one notes the change in the light. Yet for the girl, her mother's absence became the architecture of everything that followed. With her death arrived responsibility, arrived the understanding that sentiment was a luxury and that work was the only reliable thing. Her father had not remarried, had not sought to soften the household's edges with another woman's presence. Instead, he had drawn his daughter into the work of the workshop with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything, not unkindly, but with an absence of apology. By the time she was 12, she could measure the dye plants with her eyes, could predict with reasonable accuracy how long a bolt of cloth should remain in a vat before achieving the desired saturation. Her father began to trust her with the more delicate work, the pieces commissioned by wealthy merchants' wives who demanded particular shades and were willing to pay for precision. These transactions taught her something valuable and unexpected, that the world operated through a language of unspoken agreements, that a merchant's satisfaction rested not only on the quality of the work, but on the manner in which the work was presented, and that a woman's competence could be rendered invisible, even as her labor was indispensable. The dyer's household occupied rooms above the workshop, modest but clean, with the particular order that comes from a man managing his life without a woman's presence to soften its edges. There was no excess, no frivolity, yet her father was not cruel. He was distant in the way of men who have learned that distance prevents disappointment, and he possessed a dry humor that surfaced rarely but reliably, usually when some customer made an unreasonable demand, or when the city's authorities attempted to impose new regulations on the guild. She learned humor from him, the kind that observes without malice, that finds absurdity in the pretensions of the powerful without drawing attention to the observation. It was during her 15th year that the question of the future began to present itself, though not explicitly. Such things were never discussed directly. Instead, the future arrived in fragments. A neighbor's daughter announced as betrothed, her father's increased attentiveness to a young man from a neighboring family who worked in the grain trade, the way her father began to assess her work with a new kind of scrutiny, as though calculating what she might bring to another household. The grain merchant's son was named Claude. He came to the workshop occasionally on business, and he was neither handsome nor particularly disagreeable. He was steady, practical, the sort of man who would provide and not demand too much. His family was respectable, his prospects were modest but secure. The girl observed all of this with the clarity that comes from having learned early to watch the world without drawing attention to her watching. She noted the way her father's shoulders relaxed slightly in Claude's presence, the way the conversation between the two men carried the weight of negotiation even when they were discussing the price of cloth. She understood, without being told, that her father was aging, that the workshop would require hands beyond his own, and that his daughter might be the means by which the work continued. She did not resent this knowledge. It simply was, like the vats of dye and the weight of the cloth and the particular smell of copper that had become the smell of her own skin. Yet before the betrothal was formalized, before the future could arrive in its full shape, something intervened. Not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of aging. Her father's hands, those stained instruments of his craft, began to shake. At first it was barely perceptible, a tremor that appeared only when he was tired or when the morning was particularly cold. But it progressed with the steady patience of all such things. By winter, he could no longer do the most delicate work. By spring, the shaking had spread to make even simple tasks uncertain. The tremor was not a disease that anyone could name precisely. It was simply the body's rebellion, the way the world occasionally reminded even the most competent among us that control was always provisional. She did not recall a conversation in which her father acknowledged what was happening. Instead, she began to assume more of the work, to train her hands in techniques she had only observed before, to develop the instincts that would allow her to manage the workshop's production without her father's constant assessment. He watched her work in silence, and in that silence existed both a kind of pride and a kind of sorrow. She was becoming capable, which meant he was becoming irrelevant. She was becoming indispensable, which meant that he was being replaced. These truths existed simultaneously, without contradiction. It was also during this period that she encountered, for the first time in a way that mattered, the world of authority and power. A new official from the city came to inspect the dyer's workshop, ostensibly to ensure that regulations were being observed. but actually, she understood, to assess whether additional fees might be extracted. He was polite, which made him more dangerous than if he had been openly corrupt. He moved through the workshop with the manner of a man examining property that did not quite belong to him, and he engaged her father in a conversation that was nominally about dye vats, but was actually about something else entirely, about the unspoken understanding that certain payments made quietly and without acknowledgement ensured that an inspector's visits would become less frequent. She watched her father navigate this exchange with a care that bordered on humility. He did not challenge the official's authority or his implicit suggestion. Instead, he acknowledged the legitimacy of regulation, expressed appropriate concern about compliance, and ensured that a modest gift of particularly fine cloth was ready as the inspector prepared to depart. There was no explicit mention of money. There was no threat, no coercion that anyone would have described as such. Yet the exchange was perfectly understood by all parties. She saw in that moment that the world was structured by these unspoken agreements, that power operated most effectively not through force, but through a kind of courteous acknowledgement of hierarchy, and that those who wished to survive within this structure had to learn to read these signals without acknowledging that they were reading them. By her 17th year, her father's hands had become nearly useless for the detailed work. Yet he continued to come to the workshop each morning, to observe, to make decisions about which commissions to accept and how to price them. He had become the mind of the enterprise, while she had become its hands. The transition was neither celebrated nor mourned. It was simply the shape that their lives had taken. She did not consciously calculate what this meant for her future, but the knowledge was present nonetheless. She would not leave this place, would not escape into some imagined world beyond the quarter. She would marry Claude, probably, or another man like him, and she would bring to that marriage the competence and the discipline she had learned in her father's workshop. Her life would be shaped by the same quiet acceptance of necessity that had shaped her childhood. Yet there was also in her 16th and 17th years something else, a kind of internal life that existed in the spaces between work and duty. A private awareness that the girl she was, the young woman she was becoming, possessed thoughts and observations that did not fit neatly into the role that the world had prepared for her. She noticed the particular way light fell through the workshop windows in late afternoon, the way certain colors emerged from the vats and then faded, the way people revealed themselves in small gestures when they believed no one was watching. She had not yet developed a language for this inner life, and she had learned early that to speak of such things was to invite dismissal or concern. So she kept these observations to herself, let them accumulate in the quiet of early morning or the darkness before sleep, and developed a kind of subtle irony, a humor that observed without judgment, that would later become one of her primary instruments for understanding the world. Claude's courtship, when it began more formally, proceeded with the same orderly quality that characterized everything in the quarter. He visited on specific afternoons. He brought modest gifts. He demonstrated respect for her father's position and competence. He did not speak to her with particular intimacy or intensity. Yet there was in his manner a straightforward kind of regard, a recognition that she was a capable person who would make a reliable wife and a useful partner in whatever enterprise they might manage together. She responded to this with the same practicality she brought to everything else. She did not imagine love in the way the old songs suggested it might exist. She imagined instead a kind of partnership, a shared navigation of the material world, an acknowledgement that they would make a life together because it was the logical thing to do. In the last year before the betrothal was formalized, something small but significant shifted in her inner world. She began to understand, dimly at first, and then with increasing clarity, that she possessed a kind of power that came not from authority or wealth, but from her own competence and her capacity to observe without being observed. Men came to the workshop seeking her father's expertise, but increasingly they were also assessing her knowledge, her ability to manage complex work, her reliability. She noticed that she could influence outcomes, could guide conversations toward particular conclusions, could make people feel comfortable or cautious, depending on what the moment seemed to require. This power was not large or dramatic, but it was real, and it was hers, and it grew from nothing but her own attention and skill. The world she inhabited was ordered by rules that she had not written and did not choose. But within those rules, there existed a kind of freedom, a freedom to become competent, to make herself indispensable, to build a life that rested on her own capacity, rather than on anyone else's generosity or goodwill. She did not yet fully understand what this meant or where it might lead, but something in her recognized it, treasured it, held it close in the darkness, like a secret that belonged only to herself. When Claude asked her father for her hand, and when her father gave his blessing, she accepted this future with the same equanimity she brought to everything else. Yet underneath, something in her was already calculating, already preparing for a life that would require all the discipline, all the observation, all the careful navigation of unspoken rules that her childhood had taught her. The river smelled different in autumn than in spring, less of renewal and more of dissolution. The water carrying the debris of the season downward toward some distant confluence. The tavern occupied a narrow plot between a fuller's shop and a warehouse belonging to the Grain Merchants' Guild, a location that was neither prestigious nor entirely disreputable. It was, in other words, precisely what a young couple of modest means could afford in the year when the old century was yielding to the new, and the city of Lyon was beginning to recognize itself as something more than a provincial crossing point, a place where real money moved, where fortunes were made and lost, where a person attentive enough might find opportunity in the margins. Her father had died 2 years after the betrothal was formalized. The illness came suddenly, in the form of a fever that burned through the quarter like a small fire, taking the baker's wife, the blacksmith's apprentice, and the dyer himself in the space of a single week. She had nursed him with the same practical competence she brought to everything, cooling his forehead with cloths, spooning broth into a mouth that could no longer quite remember how to swallow, sitting beside him in the long nights when the fever seemed to recede slightly, and then return with renewed intensity. When he died, she felt the loss as a kind of lightning, a terrible acknowledgement that she was relieved to be free of the responsibility, followed immediately by shame at that relief, followed almost as quickly by the understanding that such contradictions were simply part of how the world worked, and that there was no point in dwelling on them. The workshop passed to her as the only surviving child, but it passed into a world that had no particular use for a woman dyer, especially one who was now married. Claude had been kind, in his way. He had not demanded that she sell the business immediately, had not insisted that she become a conventional wife concerned only with household management. Yet the implicit message was clear. She was now his responsibility, and the workshop represented a kind of independence that was at odds with that arrangement. When the opportunity arose to lease the tavern, Claude had presented it as a practical solution, a business they could manage together, something that would generate income without requiring her to maintain a separate enterprise in the guild quarter where her presence as a woman would increasingly be questioned. She had agreed to this transition with the same pragmatism that characterized her approach to most things. The workshop was sold to a younger craftsman with family connections to the guild. The inventory was dispersed, and she and Claude signed the lease for the tavern in the presence of a notary who barely glanced at her, addressing all his remarks to her husband, as though she were simply an object being transferred from one property to another. It did not occur to her to resent this. It was simply how such matters were conducted. Instead, she had begun almost immediately to assess what the tavern might become. Not what it was, but what it might be made to be, through attention and care. The first months were harder than she had anticipated. A tavern in the docks quarter was not a dyer's workshop. It operated according to different rhythms, attracted a different sort of person, demanded different skills. The previous keeper had been a man of limited ambition, who had allowed the place to decline into a kind of slovenly comfort, the kind of establishment where no one was surprised to find a rat in the corner, or to discover that the wine was occasionally watered beyond what even the most indifferent patron would tolerate. The space itself was dark and cramped, the tables scarred from years of use, the rushes on the floor harboring the accumulated filth of seasons. Yet it was in this unpromising space that she discovered something unexpected, a kind of enthusiasm for the work that went beyond mere practical necessity. She began by scrubbing, by replacing the rushes regularly, by ensuring that the kitchen maintained standards of cleanliness that bordered on fastidious. She tasted the wine herself and had difficult conversations with the suppliers about quality. She began to notice patterns in who came and when, what they drank, what sort of atmosphere encouraged them to linger and spend more. She did not do these things according to any deliberate strategy. They simply emerged from her nature, from the same attentiveness that had served her in the dyer's workshop, but now applied to a different material. Claude worked in the grain trade, which meant he was frequently absent. His routes took him downriver to the mills that supplied Lyon's bakers, and occasionally as far as Marseille on ventures that he described in vague terms, and that seemed to involve both profit and risk. His absences were not unwelcome. They gave her space to manage the tavern according to her own instincts, without the subtle friction that arose from his presence. He was not unkind, and he was not deliberately controlling, but he inhabited the world with a kind of confidence in his own judgment that was somewhat at odds with her own inclination to observe before acting. When he was away, she could simply do the work. When he was present, she had to navigate the small negotiations that arose from their different temperaments. Their marriage had settled into something that resembled affection, though it was affection of a very particular sort, the kind that comes from genuine respect and practical cooperation, rather than from passion or deep emotional intimacy. They shared a bed regularly enough that within the first year she had become pregnant. The pregnancy had filled her with a kind of quiet terror that she did not discuss with anyone. She had watched her mother die, had watched other women in the quarter endure the particular violence of childbirth, had understood since childhood that this was a danger that balanced against the alternative danger of remaining unmarried and unprotected. When the miscarriage came in the 4th month, precipitated by a moment of inattention when she failed to notice a step in the tavern's back room and fell heavily, she experienced a relief so profound that it frightened her. She lay in the bed for a week, bleeding heavily, while Claude brought in a midwife to assess the damage. The midwife was an old woman with very clear eyes and very kind hands, and she examined Marguerite with a thoroughness that bordered on intimate. When the examination was complete, the midwife had said simply, "You are intact. There would be other chances if you wish them." It was not stated as a blessing or as a curse. It was stated as a fact. When Claude asked what the midwife had said, she told him simply that she had fallen and the child had not survived, but that she was otherwise well. He had nodded, expressed appropriate regret, and returned to his work. They did not discuss it further. She understood that this was how such things were managed, through a kind of collective silence that acknowledged pain without requiring anyone to speak of it. What surprised her was the absence of desperate longing for another child. She had expected to grieve the loss, to desire another pregnancy, to feel the lack of maternal fulfillment as a wound. Instead, she found that the loss had released something in her, a recognition that she had been dreading the prospect of pregnancy and childbirth, that the miscarriage, terrible as it was physically, had been emotionally liberating. The understanding brought shame, which she also kept to herself. She did not believe there was language available to her for such contradictions, and even if there had been, there was no one to whom it would have been appropriate to speak. So she added this knowledge to the accumulating collection of thoughts and observations that she kept locked in the interior of her own mind. And she returned to the work of the tavern with a sense that she had been given an unexpected reprieve. It was during the period after the miscarriage that the tavern began to develop into something more than simply a place where men drank. She started with small changes: better ale served at the right temperature, bread from a particular baker who understood quality, sausages prepared by a widow who had developed a reputation for precision. But gradually, almost without her quite recognizing it was happening, the tavern became a kind of gathering place for men involved in trade. Merchants would come in the afternoon to discuss negotiations. Dock workers would arrive at dusk with coins from their labor. Minor officials would take tables in the corners and conduct business in voices that were careful but not quite quiet enough. She learned, through this constant exposure, the language of commerce, the way prices were discussed and negotiated, the kinds of relationships that existed between the various trading guilds, the particular vulnerabilities and strengths of different kinds of business. She learned the names of merchants' wives and daughters, could inquire about family matters in ways that seemed personal, but were actually carefully calculated to build connection. She learned which men were trustworthy and which were inclined toward sharp practice, which ones were vulnerable to certain kinds of persuasion, and which ones operated according to strict principles that could not be swayed. Most importantly, she learned the extraordinary power of listening without seeming to listen, of remembering small details from months before and bringing them into conversation in a way that made people feel recognized and valued. She did not consciously design this performance. It emerged from her nature and from the particular circumstances of her position. She was a woman, which meant she was, in theory, beneath the consideration of most of the men who passed through the tavern. Yet she was also the keeper of the tavern, which meant she occupied a position of authority within her own space. She was married, which gave her a kind of respectability, yet her husband's frequent absences meant that she was often present alone, or with only servants, which granted her a kind of freedom that a more closely supervised wife would not have possessed. These contradictions created a space in which she could operate with a kind of latitude that would have been impossible in other circumstances. Her humor, which had developed in the dyer's workshop as a kind of private observation, began to transform into a social instrument. She developed a capacity to make people laugh without making them feel mocked, to make observations that were slightly cutting but never cruel, to diffuse tension through the judicious deployment of a well-timed comment. Men came to appreciate this quality in her. They began to see her not simply as a tavern keeper, but as something closer to a confidant, a person to whom they might allude to their troubles, knowing that she would listen without judgment and would not repeat what she had heard. By the time 5 years had passed since opening the tavern, something had solidified in the local merchant community's perception of the place. It had become reliable. The drink was honest, the food was good, and the keeper was someone who could be trusted with small confidences. When disputes arose between merchants, they sometimes came to the tavern to conduct negotiations, knowing that Marguerite would provide a neutral ground and might even offer insight into what the other party was thinking or what concerns might be addressed to facilitate agreement. She had not sought this role. It had arrived through a kind of accumulated trust that came from never betraying a confidence, from always being fair, from treating everyone with the same careful courtesy, regardless of their station. It was also during this period that Claude's absences became more extended. His ventures downriver and toward Marseille seemed to consume more and more of his time. When he was present at the tavern, he was often distant, preoccupied with business concerns that he did not discuss in detail. She did not ask for details. She had learned that a certain discretion was valuable in a marriage, that the less one knew about a husband's affairs, the less one had to worry about them. Yet, she began to notice other things. The particular quality of his silences, the way he sometimes seemed to be bracing himself against some internal pressure, the occasional conversation with other traders that seemed to leave him troubled. When the news came that his ship had been lost off the coast near Marseille, the initial response was shock, followed almost immediately by a practical assessment of what the loss meant. She was now a widow, though there was no body, no certainty, only the testimony of a survivor who had reported that Claude had gone below decks and had not emerged when the ship foundered. The survivor was an older man with a reputation for reliability, and he was careful in his account. He had not seen Claude die, but he had seen the circumstances and understood them to be almost certainly fatal. What surprised her was the absence of passionate grief. She mourned Claude, certainly. He had been kind to her, had treated her with respect, had never been deliberately cruel. Yet his death did not shatter her. Instead, it opened a space that she had not fully recognized she had been occupying, a space in which she had been waiting for something, though she could not have named what that something was. With his death arrived a kind of liberation that came tinged with guilt and shame, but was liberation nonetheless. The legal process of establishing his death and settling his affairs was complicated and required her to navigate a world of notaries, relatives, and officials. A world that looked at her with a particular kind of assessment, trying to determine whether she was a vulnerable widow to be protected or a threat to be managed. She discovered that the world treated a widow quite differently than it treated a wife, that her vulnerability came with a kind of freedom that she had not fully possessed before. She was now, in the eyes of the law, a femme sole, a woman alone, which meant that she could own property, conduct business, and manage her own affairs in ways that had been impossible when she was under her husband's nominal authority. His modest estate passed to her, including debts that she had not known existed. Yet his reputation in the grain trade was sufficiently sound that the debts were manageable, and she was able to discharge them over a period of months through careful management of the tavern's income. The other merchants seemed to accept her as a legitimate participant in their world, perhaps because she had already been a kind of informal presence in their negotiations, perhaps because she demonstrated competence and reliability, perhaps because they recognized that a widow-keeper had the same interest in honest dealing that they did. Within a year of Claude's death, the tavern had become more prosperous than it had been while he lived. She had made small improvements, expanded the kitchen slightly, added a few tables in a back room where private conversations could be conducted, established a reputation for discretion that meant that some of the city's more delicate business was conducted in her establishment. She employed 2 serving women and a kitchen helper, managed their work with firm but fair judgment, and began to accumulate a modest surplus of coin that she kept carefully hidden in the tavern's cellar in a locked chest beneath the storage area where no one would think to look. She did not define herself in relation to Claude's absence. It was simply the circumstance in which she found herself. She was a widow, a tavern keeper, a woman of modest but genuine means, in a city where such positions were rare enough to be noteworthy. She had survived the particular vulnerability of widowhood by being too competent to be vulnerable, by making herself so valuable to the merchant community that they had an interest in her continued prosperity. This was not a strategy that she had chosen deliberately. It was simply the shape that her life had taken, the particular form of security that a woman of her station could achieve through work and attention. Yet in the evenings, when the tavern was closed, and she sat alone by the small fire in her private room, she sometimes found herself thinking about the girl she had been, the dyer's daughter, careful and observant, hidden behind competence and duty. That girl had possessed a kind of private inner life that had been bright and contained and entirely her own. She wondered sometimes whether that inner life had been sacrificed in the work of becoming a tavern keeper, or whether it had simply been transformed into something more practical and less dangerous. She did not arrive at an answer. She simply held both possibilities in her mind and returned to the business of the next day. Winter had a particular quality in Lyon when it arrived in earnest. The cold did not merely chill the air, but seemed to settle into the bones of the city itself, making the river move sluggishly, and the stones underfoot treacherous with ice. It was in such a winter, some years after Claude's death, that Gerard Richelt first became a regular patron of the tavern. He arrived on a gray afternoon when the light was already failing, moving with the unhurried manner of a man accustomed to occupying space without needing to justify his presence. He was perhaps 50 years old, perhaps older, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent significant time outdoors despite his obvious station. His clothing spoke of wealth. The wool of his cloak was of exceptional quality. The clasp that held it was silver, yet there was nothing ostentatious about his bearing. He simply ordered wine and took a table in the corner, observing the tavern with an appraising but not unkind gaze. She recognized immediately that this was a man of consequence. It was not merely the quality of his clothing or the deference with which the other patrons treated him. It was something more subtle, a kind of ease that came from being accustomed to having one's needs anticipated and accommodated. She brought him the better wine without being asked, and when he looked at her with mild surprise, she simply inclined her head slightly and returned to her work. He did not comment on the gesture. He simply drank the wine with apparent appreciation and returned the next evening at approximately the same hour. This pattern continued throughout the winter and into the spring. Richelt arrived regularly, usually in the late afternoon, ordered the better wine, and occupied his corner table while reading or simply observing the other patrons. Gradually, a kind of familiarity developed between them, not intimacy, but the comfortable distance of two people who understand each other's particular requirements without needing explicit discussion. She learned that he preferred his wine at a particular temperature, that he appreciated bread from a specific baker, that he sometimes brought documents that he would read with a kind of careful attention that suggested they contained matters of significance. It was not until several months had passed that Richelt began to speak to her beyond the basic exchange of commerce. The transition was subtle and natural, emerging from a moment when the tavern was nearly empty and she had paused beside his table to refill his cup. He had looked up from his documents and made an observation about the quality of the wine, and she had responded with a comment that was slightly more engaged than her usual courtesy. The conversation had been brief, lasting perhaps a few minutes, but it had established something, a recognition that they could speak to each other as thinking beings rather than as merchant and seller. From that point forward, Richelt began to share small confidences with her. Nothing of great consequence, nothing that compromised anyone's position, but details about his family, observations about the state of the cloth trade, complaints about the difficulty of managing partners who did not share one's standards. He spoke of his wife in terms that were respectful but distant. They had been married for many years, he explained, and had settled into an arrangement that served both their interests. He had a son from his first marriage who had disappointed him by declining to enter the family business, choosing instead to pursue the clergy. There was something in the way he spoke of this disappointment that suggested it cut deeper than he was willing to admit openly. She listened to these confidences with the same quality of attention she had learned to bring to all matters of the tavern. She did not offer advice or moral judgment. She did not probe for details beyond what he freely offered. She simply acknowledged his words with small gestures and expressions, creating a space in which he could speak without feeling foolish or exposed. This capacity for listening seemed to comfort him. He began to arrive more frequently, and his visits sometimes extended into the evening, sitting long after his wine was finished, simply remaining in the tavern's quiet corners. Over the course of a year or more, a kind of friendship developed between them, or perhaps not friendship in the way such things were conventionally understood, but something that served many of the same functions. When his business ventures were troubled, he would mention them to her and would often discover that she had useful insight into the situation, drawn from her observations of other merchants and their concerns. When he was pleased by something, a successful negotiation, a piece of cloth of particular beauty, he would share his pleasure with her. She never initiated these conversations, never drew him out with questions designed to extract information. She simply created the conditions in which he could speak if he chose to, and he frequently chose to do so. The inequality of their stations was always present, always acknowledged in the careful protocols they maintained. She called him Monsieur Richelt. He called her by her first name, a familiarity that would have been impossible between them in other contexts. When he paid for his wine and food, she never extended him the kind of credit she extended to some of the regular patrons. When he left coins as gratuity, she never refused them or minimized their importance. Yet within these constraints, something genuine emerged. A recognition of each other as capable and thoughtful people who occupied radically different positions in the world's hierarchy, but who could nonetheless understand each other's concerns and perspectives. It was perhaps 2 years into Richelt's regular patronage that she began to notice something had shifted in him, a kind of unease that manifested itself in different ways. He came less regularly, and when he did arrive, he seemed distracted, sometimes reading documents with an intensity that suggested they contained disturbing information. Once, she observed him reading the same passage several times, as though he could not quite believe what the words conveyed. When she asked if something troubled him, he had paused for a long moment before responding that business was simply more complicated than it had been in earlier years, that partnerships were being tested in ways he had not anticipated. It was around this time that she began to notice another patron in the tavern, a man named Mathieu, who she eventually understood was Richelt's business partner. Mathieu was perhaps a decade younger than Richelt, with a sharp quality to his features that suggested both intelligence and a lack of scruples about how that intelligence was deployed. He occasionally came to the tavern, and she observed that his demeanor changed noticeably when Richelt was present. If Richelt was already seated, Mathieu would greet him with apparent warmth, and they would conduct business in low voices. Yet there was something in the quality of Mathieu's attention that troubled her, a kind of calculation that was visible only if one knew how to read such things. One evening, she overheard a fragment of conversation between Richelt and another merchant about a discrepancy in Mathieu's accounting. The conversation was brief and carefully phrased, but it was clear that Richelt was beginning to suspect that something was amiss in the partnership's finances. The merchant had suggested that such matters were sensitive and should be handled with discretion, implying that confrontation might lead to complications. Richelt had simply nodded and changed the subject, but his expression had suggested that the conversation had confirmed suspicions he had already begun to harbor. Weeks passed, and the unease in Richelt seemed to deepen. He came to the tavern less frequently, and when he did, he carried with him an air of distraction that was more pronounced than before. Once she brought him wine, and he did not even acknowledge her presence. He was lost in thought, staring into the middle distance with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with something that had no easy resolution. When she gently asked if he was well, he had looked at her as though surprised to find himself in the tavern, and then had apologized with a courtesy that seemed to cost him effort. It was during this period that she began to notice other details, small things that accumulated into a kind of pattern. Richelt's clothing, usually immaculate, sometimes appeared less carefully maintained. He made comments that suggested he was sleeping poorly. Once, a woman who she recognized as his wife arrived at the tavern seeking him, a rare occurrence, and had looked around with the particular expression of a woman who was surprised and mildly disapproving to find her husband in such a place. He had received her with apparent warmth, but also with visible tension, and the two had spoken quietly in a corner before he had escorted her out. The nature of her knowledge began to shift. Previously, she had understood Richelt through his own carefully edited accounts of his life, the narratives he chose to share with her. Now she was beginning to read between these narratives, to understand that there were pressures and concerns that he was not mentioning, struggles that he was managing alone. She did not ask about these things. To do so would have been to violate the careful boundaries that made their relationship possible. Yet her awareness of his troubles deepened the quality of her attention to him, created in her a kind of concern that went beyond the professional. One evening in the late spring, nearly 3 years after Richelt had first become a regular patron, he arrived at the tavern in what appeared to be a state of considerable agitation. His usual composure was absent. He ordered wine in a tone that was sharper than his usual manner, and he sat at his table with the kind of restless energy of a man who was struggling to contain something that demanded release. When she brought his wine, he asked her if she would sit with him for a moment, a request that was entirely unusual and that violated numerous protocols of behavior that governed their interaction. She sat across from him, her posture communicating both willingness to listen and awareness of the impropriety of the situation. Several patrons glanced in their direction, and she was conscious of how the gesture would be interpreted, as a sign that something unusual was occurring, that Richelt was troubled in ways that required even the tavern keeper's personal attention. Richelt seemed aware of this as well, yet he did not modify his behavior. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was low but intense. "There are circumstances," he said, "where a man discovers that those he has trusted have betrayed that trust in ways that are both profound and practical. Do you understand what I am saying?" She understood perfectly. She also understood that he was not truly asking for her understanding, but rather for her presence, for permission to speak of something that he could not discuss with anyone in his own sphere without creating consequences that he was not prepared to accept. She nodded slightly, communicating that she was willing to receive whatever he was about to say. "A partnership can be destroyed," he continued, "by greed and dishonesty. And when one discovers this, one faces a choice: to confront the dishonesty and risk serious consequences, or to accept the dishonesty and live with the knowledge of one's own complicity. Do you find that an accurate description of how such matters proceed?" Again she nodded. He fell silent for a long moment, and she understood that he had said what he needed to say. Not the full truth, but enough to have articulated the shape of his problem to another person. To have said it aloud to someone who understood was, perhaps, enough. "I am grateful for your discretion," he said finally, "and for the space you provide. There are few places in this city where a man can think clearly." After that evening, Richelt's visits became less frequent again, but they carried a different quality. He seemed, paradoxically, both more troubled and more at peace, as though having acknowledged the nature of his problem had granted him some kind of acceptance of it. He continued to sit in his corner, continued to order the better wine, continued to acknowledge her presence with a courtesy that was genuine despite the gap in their stations. She found herself watching him with increased attention, aware that something was moving toward conclusion, though she could not have articulated what that conclusion might be. In the weeks that followed Richelt's unusual request to sit with him, she noticed that he occasionally brought documents with him and would work on them with an intensity that suggested they were of great importance. Once, when a piece of parchment fell from his table, she retrieved it and handed it back to him without looking at it. But she had caught a glimpse of numbers and notations that suggested accounts of some kind, records, perhaps, or evidence of something. She did not ask about it. Yet her awareness that Richelt was documenting something, gathering evidence of something, added another layer to her understanding of the situation. It was on an evening in early autumn when Richelt came to the tavern in a state of particular agitation, more pronounced than anything she had witnessed before. He ordered wine but did not drink it. He sat at his table with the quality of a man who was bracing himself for something difficult. Other patrons were present, the tavern was relatively full, and she was occupied with serving and managing the space. Yet she was conscious of his presence in a way that was more acute than usual. Something in his bearing suggested that this evening would mark some kind of transition. He remained at his table until well after the normal hour of closing, and the other patrons gradually departed. When the tavern was empty except for him, she began the work of closing, banking the fire, clearing the tables, preparing the space for the next day. She did not ask him to leave, though it was unusual for a patron to remain so late. She worked around his presence, conscious that he seemed to be gathering himself for something, a conversation, a confession, a decision. Finally, when the tavern was secured and she was preparing to retire to her private quarters, he stood and approached her directly. In his hand, he held a small purse of coins, more substantial than his usual gratuity. "I may not return for some time," he said. "There are matters that require my attention, and the resolution of those matters is uncertain. I wanted to ensure that you understood that the space you have provided here has been valuable to me. I am grateful." She accepted the purse and inclined her head. She did not ask what matters he was referring to, or what kind of absence he was anticipating. To do so would have been to step beyond the boundaries that had always contained their relationship. Instead, she simply acknowledged his words with the same courtesy she had always shown him. "You are always welcome here," she said simply. He nodded, and there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the weight of that statement, that it was not merely a conventional pleasantry, but a genuine assurance that his place in the tavern would remain, that whatever happened in the larger world would not change the particular refuge that she provided. He departed into the autumn evening, and she watched him go with a sense that something significant had concluded, though what that something was she could not have articulated. She stood alone in the closed tavern, holding the purse he had left, aware that she had been witness to something that mattered, though not yet understanding what the consequences of that witnessing might be. The morning that the news arrived, the city seemed indifferent to its significance. The autumn was progressing toward winter with no particular drama. The market functioned as it always did. The river continued its patient work of carrying the refuse of human commerce toward the sea. A merchant whom she knew only slightly came to the tavern in the middle of the morning and, while waiting for his ale, mentioned to no one in particular that Gerard Richelt had been found dead in his study. The death, according to this account, had been sudden and apparently natural. A seizure of the heart, the physician had suggested, though no physician had actually examined him while he lived. The news created a peculiar silence within her. She continued her work, serving the merchant his ale, managing the kitchen, addressing the small concerns that occupied her attention throughout the day. While something inside her seemed to have stopped moving, she did not allow herself to dwell on Richelt's death. She did not permit herself the luxury of grief, or even of surprise. Yet something in the world had shifted. A space that had been occupied for years had become empty. A particular kind of attention that she had brought to her evenings had suddenly become unnecessary. It was not until the following day, when another merchant came to the tavern and provided more detailed information, that the first seeds of uncertainty were planted. This merchant, a man named Bertrand, who dealt in spices and often conducted business in her tavern, had been at Richelt's funeral and had spoken with people who had been present at the house when the body was discovered. According to Bertrand, The details of Richelt's death were somewhat less straightforward than the initial account had suggested. The servant who had found him reported that his expression had been one of distress rather than peaceful sleep. There were signs, though not conclusive ones, that he had consumed something the evening before. The tavern had been mentioned, and several people had been present who might have had reason to wish him harm. She listened to this account while maintaining her usual demeanor of polite attention, neither encouraging nor discouraging Bertrand's narrative. Yet her mind was working with the intensity it brought to problems that required solution. She recalled with sudden clarity that Richelt had indeed been at the tavern on the evening before his death. She had seen him arrive in the late afternoon, had served him wine as she always did, had observed him becoming gradually more animated as other patrons arrived. And she recalled something else, something that she had registered at the time, but had not consciously processed until this moment. One of those patrons had been a man named Philippe, a merchant who dealt in wool and who had, on previous occasions, conducted business with Richelt. But on this particular evening, their interaction had been charged with tension. Philippe had approached Richelt's table, and they had spoken in low voices for some time. She had been occupied with other patrons and had not deliberately listened, yet certain phrases had reached her ears. She recalled hearing Richelt say something about a matter of trust, and Philippe responding with words that might have been defensive or might have been threatening. It was difficult to determine which, given the constrained nature of their exchange. There had been something else as well, something small but now significant in retrospect. When Philippe had brought Richelt a cup of wine, she had not recalled this until the moment of recalling it. The gesture had been courteous, but her attention had registered something odd about it. She tried to reconstruct the moment. Had she seen Philippe deliberately placing something in the cup? Or was she simply reconstructing what she now suspected might have happened, filling in gaps in her memory with the shape that logic suggested events must have taken? She could not be certain. When the bailiff came to question the tavern keepers regarding Richelt's final evening, she provided a factual account of his presence and his behavior. She mentioned that he had seemed somewhat agitated, that he had consumed wine, the better wine that she kept for her regular patrons, and that he had spoken with several people during the evening. The bailiff, a man whose face suggested both stupidity and a kind of calculated shrewdness, listened to her account with an expression that suggested he was already satisfied with the conclusion he had reached. He asked a few perfunctory questions about who else had been present, seemed to accept her responses without genuine interest, and appeared to be preparing to conclude his inquiry. Yet before he departed, he had paused and addressed her directly. "A man of Richelt's standing sometimes accrues enemies," he said. "Men who believe themselves wronged, men whose ambitions are thwarted. It is easy to assume that such enemies might take action. But in my experience, men of standing more often die from the simple failure of their bodies than from deliberate harm. The heart is a weak instrument. When it fails, we need not look for poison. Nature is explanation enough." The bailiff had delivered this statement with the tone of a man sharing practical wisdom, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested a different meaning beneath the words. He seemed to be communicating something to her, a message that involved the conclusion that Richelt's death was natural, and that any suggestion otherwise would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous. She had simply nodded and thanked him for his attention to the matter, and he had departed the tavern with the air of a man whose work was complete. In the days and weeks following Richelt's death and funeral, She found herself occupied with the work of managing the tavern in the usual ways. Yet her mind was working on a different level entirely. She was reconstructing that evening, examining her memories with the intensity she had once brought to examining dye colors to determine their precise saturation. She was asking herself what she had actually witnessed and what she had inferred, what was certain and what was speculation. And she was confronting a particular problem. She had information that suggested something other than natural death, yet she possessed no power to act on that information, no position from which to question the bailiff's conclusion, no authority to investigate what had occurred. The peculiar powerlessness of her position became acute when she began to understand, through the gossip and conversation of her patrons, what the consequences of Richelt's death had been. His widow, Isabel, was remarrying with remarkable speed to a man of considerable station, a situation that would have been impossible if there had been any suspicion of foul play attached to Richelt's death. The speed of the remarriage suggested that either Isabel had been remarkably eager to secure her future, or that someone with power had been eager to secure hers. The man she was marrying was connected in ways that were not entirely clear to the bailiff. The connection suggested a kind of arrangement, a transaction in which Richelt's widow received security and her new husband received something else, perhaps the management of Richelt's business interests. It was through her observations of the merchant community that she began to understand the deeper implications of what had occurred. Mathieu Richelt, the business partner whom she had observed with growing suspicion, seemed to have gained control of the cloth business that he and Girard had managed together. Yet the manner in which he had gained this control suggested something other than a natural inheritance or a straightforward business succession. There was something hasty about it, something that suggested arrangements had been made in advance, agreements established that simply awaited Richelt's removal from the world. She found herself watching Mathieu with new intensity when he came to the tavern, which he did with increased frequency now that his former partner was dead. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had achieved something he desired. Yet there was also in his demeanor something that suggested he was waiting for complications that might still arise. He would glance in her direction occasionally, and she had the distinct sense that he was assessing her, determining whether she posed any threat, whether she had witnessed anything that might require management. It was during this period that she made a deliberate decision to observe more carefully, to listen more intently, to accumulate knowledge about what had actually occurred. She did not formulate a plan for what she might do with this knowledge. She simply recognized that she had been placed, by circumstance and by Richelt's own choice to confide in her, in a position where she knew things that others did not know. What one did with such knowledge was a question that she did not yet feel obligated to answer. She began to gather information through the conversations of her patrons, conversations that she facilitated by asking careful questions or by simply remaining present in ways that encouraged continued speech. She learned that Richelt had indeed discovered evidence of significant financial irregularity in the partnership's accounts. She learned that he had been documenting this evidence and had begun to speak of taking action, approaching guild authorities perhaps, or seeking legal remedy. She learned that his disappearance into death had been remarkably convenient for Mathieu and for others who might have had reason to wish Richelt's investigations to cease. One particular piece of information came to her through an unexpected source. A young man began coming to the tavern in the late evening hours, alone, ordering small quantities of cheap ale, and remaining for extended periods without speaking to anyone. She recognized him eventually as Pierre, a clerk in Rochelte's household, who had occasionally accompanied his employer to the tavern. The young man appeared troubled. His clothing was worn, his demeanor suggested anxiety, and he had the particular quality of someone who was carrying knowledge that burdened him. She observed him for several evenings before approaching him directly. When she brought his ale, she paused beside his table and asked, with the tone of someone making casual conversation, whether he had been affected by the death of Monsieur Rochelte. The question was deliberately open-ended, designed to encourage whatever response he might feel inclined to offer. Pierre had looked up at her with an expression that suggested he was considering whether to trust her. And then, very quietly, he had said, Monsieur Rochelte was a just man. He attempted to do what was right. It was not a direct statement, but it was a statement nonetheless. It communicated something to her, an acknowledgement that Rochelte's death was connected to his attempts at justice, that someone among the patrons of her tavern understood this connection, and that this someone was troubled by it. She had simply nodded and moved away, leaving Pierre to his ale and his thoughts. Yet she understood that she had made contact with someone who might, under the right circumstances, be willing to speak more openly about what had occurred. Over the following weeks, she began to construct a kind of map of the situation, not the complete picture, but enough to understand the shape of what had happened. Philippe, who dealt in wool, apparently owed Rochelte money that had been advanced for some venture that had not succeeded. Mathieu, Rochelte's partner, had apparently been concealing the loss of this money and others in the partnership's accounts, falsifying documents to create the appearance of continued profitability. When Rochelte had begun to investigate and had discovered the discrepancies, he had posed a threat to Mathieu's continued control of the business. The resolution of this threat had apparently been Rochelte's death. The mechanism of that death remained uncertain. She could not definitively determine whether poison had been administered or whether there had been something else entirely. What she understood was that the official conclusion that Rochelte had died of a natural seizure of the heart seemed designed more to close the matter than to investigate it. And she understood that this closure served multiple interests. Mathieu's interest in unimpeded control of the business, the bailiff's interest in avoiding complicated investigations that might implicate powerful people, Isabelle's interest in security through rapid remarriage, and Philippe's interest in avoiding exposure of his financial dishonesty. She possessed knowledge that contradicted the official narrative, yet she was aware that possessing such knowledge was dangerous. To speak openly would be to draw the attention of people who had already demonstrated, through their handling of Rochelte's death, that they were willing to manage problems through methods that went beyond the legal or the ethical. To remain silent was to participate, in a way, in the injustice that had been done. To accept that Rochelte's death would be absorbed into the world without consequence, that truth would be sacrificed to convenience. The particular torture of her position was that she existed at the intersection of multiple worlds. She was a woman, which meant she had no official standing from which to raise questions about the bailiff's investigation. She was a tavern keeper, which meant she could not claim to have expert knowledge of commercial matters or financial documents. She was unconnected to the aristocracy or the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which meant she had no patron to whom she could appeal. She was, in essence, without power, except for the power that came from her knowledge and from her position as a kind of nexus point in the community's networks of information and relationship. It was this last power, however limited, that she began to consider. She was a person to whom people spoke, in whose presence confidences were shared, whose discretion was trusted. She occupied a particular kind of authority within the tavern, not formal or official, but real nonetheless. If she were to take action, it would not be through official channels. It would be through the slower, more subtle work of ensuring that the truth, once established, could not be ignored by those with the capacity to act upon it. She did not yet know how she would proceed. She simply recognized that she had arrived at a juncture where silence and action presented themselves as distinct choices, and that the choice she made would determine the shape of everything that followed. The knowledge sat within her like a stone, heavy and real, waiting for the moment when she would decide what to do with it. The winter that followed Richelt's death was particularly harsh, the kind of season that separates those with adequate means from those who possess only the thinnest margin between survival and destitution. The river froze solid enough to walk upon, and the poor of lion huddled in doorways and beneath bridges, their bodies gradually surrendering to the cold, as though accepting it as the inevitable conclusion of lives that had never offered much else. It was during this season that Pierre, the clerk from Richelt's household, began to appear at the tavern with increasing regularity, always arriving in the late evening, always ordering the smallest quantity of ale that propriety would allow, always remaining until the other patrons had departed. She observed his decline with the particular attention she brought to everything. His clothing became more threadbare. His hands developed a tremor that suggested either cold or fear, or some combination of both. There was in his manner a quality of desperate calculation, as though he were constantly assessing whether the world might still offer him some path towards stability, and whether that path would close before he could reach it. She understood, without being told, that his position in Richelt's household had become untenable. An employer who was dead could not provide protection, and an employer's successor had no obligation to maintain his predecessor's staff. It was on an evening when the tavern was nearly empty, and the cold had driven most patrons to seek warmth elsewhere, that she finally allowed herself to speak directly to Pierre about his situation. She had brought him his ale, and instead of departing immediately, she had remained standing beside his table with the kind of informal posture that suggested she was taking a moment to rest rather than engaging in conversation. After a brief silence, she had asked him, with careful casualness, whether he had found new employment since Monsieur Richelt's death. Pierre had looked up at her with an expression that mingled surprise and something that might have been relief. The relief, perhaps, of having someone acknowledge the reality of his situation rather than continuing to pretend that such things were not occurring. He had then, very quietly, admitted that he had not found new employment, that Monsieur Mathieu had terminated his position shortly after assuming control of the business, and that his prospects were currently limited. He had not elaborated on why Mathieu had chosen to remove him, but his manner had suggested that the reason was not random or unrelated to the larger events that had surrounded Richelt's death. She had simply nodded and moved away, and she had not raised the subject again for several more evenings. Yet the knowledge of Pierre's situation had settled into her consciousness and had begun to work in ways that were both subtle and insistent. She found herself considering the particular vulnerability of a young man with no family, no connections, and no obvious means of support. She found herself aware of the price that such vulnerability imposed, the vulnerability that came from having knowledge that others wished to remain hidden, knowledge that made one dangerous to those who benefited from silence. It was her recognition of this vulnerability that led her, finally, to take action that violated her own carefully constructed principles about safety and discretion. One evening when Pierre arrived at the tavern and took his usual seat in the corner, she did not simply serve him ale and depart. Instead, she sat across from him, just as Richelle had once requested to sit with her, and she asked him directly whether he had somewhere safe to sleep. The question had been too direct, too explicit an acknowledgement of his situation to be anything other than an offer. Pierre had understood this immediately. He had looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude and shame and something that might have been fear. Fear, perhaps, that accepting her offer would place her in danger, or that his acceptance would constitute a kind of corruption of whatever protection she was offering. Yet he had also nodded very slightly, communicating that he would accept if the offer remained open. That night she had shown him to the storage room behind the kitchen, a space that was dry and reasonably warm due to its proximity to the kitchen fire. She had provided him with blankets and had ensured that he understood he could remain there through the winter. She had also established clear protocols. He was not to be seen by patrons, was not to interact with her servants beyond the minimal politeness required, was not to give any indication that he was present in the building. In exchange, she would provide him with food and warmth, not comfort, but the basic necessities of survival. The decision to shelter Pierre had emerged from something in her that was not purely rational, not purely calculated. It had emerged from the particular quality of compassion that she had cultivated in solitude, the kindness that she had learned to hide beneath layers of professional courtesy, because such kindness, if displayed openly, would have made her vulnerable to exploitation. Yet in the case of Pierre, she had found herself unable to maintain that distance. She had recognized in his situation something that touched something essential within her, perhaps a recognition of his innocence, or perhaps simply a recognition that the cost of remaining indifferent would be too high. Yet the decision also carried consequences that she had not fully calculated at the moment of making it. The presence of Pierre in her tavern, hidden though it was, became a source of constant vigilance. She was aware that if his presence were discovered, it would require explanation. It would suggest that she was harboring someone who might be considered an enemy to those who benefited from Richelle's death and from the silence that surrounded it. It would mark her, in ways both subtle and explicit, as someone who did not accept the official narrative, someone who was willing to take risks on behalf of truth. The strain of this hidden presence began to manifest itself in small ways. She found herself more cautious in her interactions with other patrons. She was more careful about what information she shared or seemed to have access to. She became more aware of being observed, of the particular quality of attention that Mathieu brought to the tavern on his occasional visits. Attention that suggested he was assessing her in ways that went beyond the normal evaluation of a tavern keeper by a customer. She understood that her silence was being interpreted as acquiescence, but that she also occupied a kind of liminal space in which she might, if she made the wrong move, be perceived as a threat. It was during this period that the first subtle signs of social ostracism began to emerge. Patrons whom she had known for years came less frequently. Merchants who had once conducted important negotiations in her tavern began to take their business elsewhere. She was aware that stories were circulating, stories that she was harboring someone, stories that she was involved in matters that were not her concern, stories that she was displaying a kind of independence and principle that was inappropriate for a woman of her station. She did not know precisely how these stories had originated, but she understood that they served a function. They isolated her. They marked her as unreliable. They prepared the ground for more serious consequences if she were to take action that directly contradicted the interests of those with power. Yet the presence of Pierre in her storage room had also begun to transform her understanding of her own situation. Each time she brought him food, each time she ensured that he had adequate blankets against the cold, each time she saw the gratitude in his eyes at the simple provision of basic care, she was making a choice about what kind of person she was willing to be. She was choosing, implicitly, that some things mattered more than safety, more than reputation, more than the comfortable isolation that had characterized her life since Claude's death. Pierre himself remained largely silent about his knowledge of Rochelle's death. Yet, through occasional, carefully circumscribed conversations, she began to understand that his knowledge was significant. He had, he explained in fragments, been present at certain moments when Rochelle had been engaged in reviewing his accounts with unusual intensity. He had heard Rochelle speaking with other merchants about irregularities in the partnership's records. He understood, though he did not state it explicitly, that Rochelle had been attempting to document evidence of Mathieu's misconduct. And Pierre understood as well that this knowledge had made him a liability, that his removal from Rochelle's household had been essentially a removal from the world of employment and respectability, a kind of exile that would have become permanent if he had been unable to find refuge. As the winter deepened, she found herself engaged in a kind of private investigation that operated at the margins of her consciousness. She was accumulating information about Mathieu's activities, about the state of the cloth business, about the merchants who appeared to be benefiting from the transition in leadership that had followed Rochelle's death. She was listening with particular attention to conversations between Mathieu and other merchants, conversations that sometimes carried undertones of threat or of deals being made in contexts where they might not have been made if Rochelle had remained alive. One evening, a merchant she recognized, but did not know well, came to the tavern, and while waiting for his wine, made a comment to another patron about the speed with which certain business arrangements had been concluded following Rochelle's death. The merchant's tone suggested that he found the speed suspicious, and the other patron had responded with a kind of meaningful silence that suggested he had observed the same phenomenon and had drawn his own conclusions. She had filed this observation away, aware that she was accumulating evidence of something, not evidence that would hold up in any legal proceeding, but evidence nonetheless, evidence that suggested a pattern, evidence that suggested the official narrative was incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. The strain of this hidden work, this accumulation of knowledge while maintaining the appearance of normal commerce, began to show in ways that she struggled to control. She found herself more irritable with her servants, more distracted during the work of managing the tavern, more prone to sitting alone in her private quarters and staring into the fire without quite seeing what lay before her. She was aware that she had made a choice about how she would proceed. Yet she was also aware that the consequences of that choice were still unfolding, and that she could not predict where they would ultimately lead. It was during one of these periods of solitary reflection that she confronted, directly, the particular nature of the choice she had made. She had chosen, by sheltering Pierre, to reject the safety that came from accepting the official narrative. She had chosen to accept that her establishment might become a location of interest to those with power, that her reputation might suffer, that the prosperity she had worked so diligently to build might be jeopardized. She had made this choice not out of courage or principle, or at least, not primarily, but out of something more fundamental, an inability to participate in injustice, while maintaining the fiction that she was not doing so. Yet she was aware as well that Pierre could not remain hidden indefinitely. Winter would eventually yield to spring. The ice on the river would melt. The season of his concealment would have to conclude, and when it did, she would be forced to make explicit decisions about how to proceed. She could not keep him hidden forever. He could not remain in the storage room indefinitely. At some point, the hidden would have to become visible. The private knowledge would have to become public, and she would have to determine what action, if any, she was prepared to take. The awareness of this coming transition created a kind of suspended tension within her. She continued her work, continued to serve her patrons, continued to maintain the appearance of a woman simply managing her business. Yet underneath, something was gathering itself, not courage exactly, but a kind of resolution, a recognition that she had already made her choice by the act of sheltering Pierre, and that everything that followed would simply be the unfolding of consequences that had already been set in motion. She was not certain whether she was prepared for what those consequences might be. Yet she was aware that she was no longer able to choose indifference, that the choice had already been made through the simple act of human kindness that had seemed so modest at the time, but which would prove ultimately to reshape everything. Spring arrived with the particular insistence that it brings after long winters. The ice breaking on the river with sounds like distant thunder, the air beginning to carry warmth again, the world slowly releasing its grip on the frozen immobility that had characterized the previous months. It was during the transition from winter to spring that she made the decision to approach the cathedral, or, more precisely, to approach one of the canons who administered the cathedral's affairs. The decision had not arrived suddenly. It had accumulated through weeks of deliberation, through conversations with Pierre that had gradually revealed more of what he knew, through her own continued observation of Mathieu and the other merchants who benefited from Richelt's death. The canon she chose to approach was a man named Etienne, a person whom she had observed over years of tavern-keeping to possess both genuine piety and a kind of practical intelligence that suggested he understood the world as it actually existed, rather than as doctrine suggested it should exist. She had seen him visit the tavern occasionally, always alone, always conducting himself with a quiet dignity that did not require ostentation. More importantly, she had observed that he maintained a kind of distance from the secular authorities, that he seemed to understand the church as an institution that could, in certain circumstances, offer a countervailing power to that of the bailiff and the merchant guilds. The approach was necessarily delicate and required that she violate numerous social protocols. She could not simply appear at the cathedral and request an audience with a canon. Such an action would draw attention, would be remarked upon, would create precisely the kind of visibility that she wished to avoid. Instead,
She waited until a day when she knew Etienne would be visiting the quarter on business related to the cathedral's properties, and she managed, through careful arrangement of her own movements, to encounter him near the cathedral as though by accident. The encounter itself was brief and careful. She had simply greeted him with the courtesy she showed to all patrons, and she had made a comment about a matter of theological interest that she knew would signal her as someone who thought beyond the immediate concerns of commerce. When he had responded with interest, she had then, very quietly, expressed a wish to speak with him about a matter of conscience.
She had suggested that the matter was of some significance, and that it related to questions of justice that seemed to fall within the purview of ecclesiastical concern, rather than secular authority. Etienne had understood what she was communicating, though she had been careful to be explicit about nothing. He had agreed to meet with her, and he had suggested a time and place, a small chamber within the cathedral, where they would not be observed, where the conversation could be conducted with discretion. When she arrived at the appointed time, she had brought with her Pierre, who, she understood, possessed crucial knowledge, and she had also brought certain documents that Richelt had left in her keeping, and that she had, through careful inquiry, understood to be evidence of Mathieu's financial irregularities. The conversation that followed was conducted with the careful quality of people who understood that they were engaging in something that could have serious consequences. She presented what she knew, what Pierre knew, what the documents suggested. She explained her concerns about the rapidity with which Richelt's death had been accepted as natural, about the suspicious circumstances surrounding his final evening at the tavern, about the pattern of events that suggested deliberate action rather than divine will. She did not make explicit accusations. She simply presented the evidence and allowed the implications to accumulate. Etienne had listened with the kind of attention that came from genuine engagement with the material being presented. When she had finished, he had asked several careful questions that suggested he was trying to determine not only what had occurred, but whether the Church had any legitimate basis for involving itself in what appeared to be a matter of secular commerce, and possibly secular crime. He had then explained, with the precision of someone who understood both law and theology, that while the evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive, it was sufficient to warrant investigation by ecclesiastical authorities. He had also explained that such an investigation would proceed more slowly than secular justice, but that it would also be more difficult to corrupt or suppress. Over the weeks that followed this initial conversation, a kind of bureaucratic machinery began to move. An investigation was opened, conducted by officials of the cathedral rather than by the city's secular authorities. Pierre was brought in to provide testimony about what he had observed in Richelt's household. The documents that Richelt had been compiling were examined by people with expertise in accounting and commerce. Witnesses were questioned in ways that suggested a genuine desire to understand what had occurred rather than a desire to close the matter quickly. During this period, the consequences of her action began to manifest themselves in increasingly visible ways. Merchants began to avoid the tavern deliberately. Some who had previously been regular patrons came less frequently, or not at all. Word began to circulate, carefully phrased but unmistakable, that the tavern keeper had aligned herself with ecclesiastical interference in merchant affairs, that she was unreliable, that she had violated the implicit codes of discretion that governed the merchant community. She found herself, in essence, ostracized by the very community that had been her source of income and of the information that had allowed her to understand the world in which she lived. The financial impact was significant and immediate. Her revenue declined noticeably. Some of her regular suppliers, uncertain about continuing to associate with someone who had drawn the attention of church authorities, began to demand cash payments rather than extending the credit they had previously offered. The margin between prosperity and struggle, which she had worked so diligently to establish, began to narrow perceptibly. Yet she found, to her own surprise, that she did not regret the decision she had made. The loss of income was difficult, but it was manageable. The loss of reputation was troubling, but it was survivable. What would not have been survivable would have been the continuation of silence, the maintenance of complicity, the choice to protect her own position at the expense of truth. It was perhaps 3 months after her initial approach to Etienne that the ecclesiastical investigation reached its conclusions. Matthew was found to have engaged in systematic falsification of accounts, to have concealed the loss of significant amounts of money through fraudulent accounting practices, and to have benefited substantially from the arrangements that had followed Richelt's death. The investigation also raised questions about whether Matthew's actions had extended to hastening Richelt's death, though this conclusion remained tentative and was based more on circumstantial suggestion than on definitive evidence. The bailiff's role in the matter was also examined, and it was determined that he had allowed political connections and personal relationships to influence his handling of the initial investigation into Richelt's death. While he was not explicitly accused of complicity in the death itself, his suppression of investigation was noted, and he was quietly removed from his position. The position itself was transferred to a younger man, who was understood to be less connected to the merchant guilds and therefore less compromised in his administration of secular justice. Richelt's widow, Isabelle, found herself in a complicated position. Her hasty remarriage had been based on what seemed to be a secure arrangement with Mathieu, but the revelation of Mathieu's misconduct and removal from power had undermined the basis of her new marriage. Yet the Church, through mechanisms that were not entirely clear to those outside the ecclesiastical hierarchy, ensured that Isabelle was not left destitute. She was granted a modest pension from church funds that had been administered by Richelt in his lifetime, and she was given sufficient discretion to manage her affairs with a degree of independence. Pierre, the young clerk who had provided crucial testimony, was offered a position in the cathedral's administrative apparatus. A modest position, certainly, but one that provided stable employment and a degree of security. He came to the tavern on the evening after his appointment had been confirmed, and he had sat at his usual table in the corner. She had brought him wine without his ordering it, and he had simply looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude and something more complex. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the price that she had paid on his behalf, and an understanding that such prices were not easily forgotten or repaid. Yet while the ecclesiastical investigation had concluded and its findings had been acted upon, the consequences for her tavern and her position in the community were only beginning to unfold. The ostracism that had begun during the investigation did not cease simply because the investigation had concluded. If anything, it deepened. Merchants who had felt themselves betrayed by her role in drawing ecclesiastical attention to their affairs became actively hostile. Some spread stories suggesting that she had used her position to entrap patrons, that she harbored political ambitions beyond her station, that she was fundamentally untrustworthy and corrupt. Yet there were also, she began to notice, some changes in the opposite direction.
A different class of patron began to appear at the tavern, not the wealthy merchants who had constituted her primary clientele before, but rather artisans, minor officials, people who had less to lose by associating with someone who had challenged the established power structures. Among these new patrons, her reputation was somewhat different. She was seen not as a woman who had overreached her station, but as someone who had possessed courage and principle, who had risked her position on behalf of truth. The financial impact of the shift in her patronage was initially severe.
Yet gradually, a kind of equilibrium began to establish itself. The tavern remained viable, though it was less prosperous than it had been at its height before Richelt's death. She found that she was able to continue to pay her employees, to maintain the quality of her establishment, to survive. What she had lost was not her ability to maintain the tavern, but rather the particular social prominence that had come from serving the wealthy merchant class. This loss was not insignificant. It represented a kind of step downward in social standing, a movement away from the particular kind of respect that came from proximity to power and wealth. Yet it also represented a kind of liberation. She was no longer required to maintain the careful balance of neutrality and discretion that had characterized her earlier years as a tavern keeper. She could speak more openly about her observations of the world. She could express opinions that did not require filtering through the lens of what would be acceptable to powerful patrons. She had, in essence, traded one kind of security for another, trading the security that came from being useful to the powerful for the security that came from having nothing left to lose. It was in the aftermath of this transition that she began to understand something about herself that she had perhaps always known, but had never fully acknowledged. She possessed, beneath the layers of practicality and caution that she had cultivated, a genuine capacity for principle, for justice, for moral action. This capacity had been submerged for much of her life beneath the necessity of managing her own survival. Yet it had always been present, and Richelt's death had provided the occasion for it to emerge. The revelation was neither comforting nor troubling. It simply was, a fact about her own nature that she now understood with clarity. She was not a woman who could comfortably accept injustice if she possessed knowledge of it. She was not a woman who could maintain silence when truth was being suppressed. These qualities had costs, as she had learned, and they might, in future circumstances, carry even higher costs. Yet they were also, she understood, essential to who she was and who she wished to be. In the months that followed the resolution of the investigation, the tavern gradually developed a new character. It became a place where people who valued truth and justice felt relatively comfortable, while those whose interests lay in the maintenance of established power structures found other locations to conduct their business. She was no longer at the center of the merchant community's information networks, but she had become, in a different way, at the center of a different kind of community, one that was smaller, less wealthy, but perhaps more honest in its dealings with the world. The city changed gradually in the years that followed, though whether it was the city itself that transformed or simply her perception of it that shifted was a question she did not attempt to resolve. The cloth trade continued, merchants continued to negotiate and compete, the river continued to flow toward the sea, carrying the detritus of commerce and human life. Yet something in the particular constellation of power and interest that had characterized Lyon in her earlier years seemed to have dispersed, reformed itself into different patterns, established new centers and peripheries. Mathieu disappeared from the city.
He was rumored to have departed for territories further east where his past might be less well known, though no one could say with certainty what had become of him. The bailiff who had closed the investigation into Richelt's death also departed, taking with him the particular form of corruption that had characterized his administration.
The city's mechanisms of justice, while still far from perfect, seemed to develop a slightly increased capacity for acknowledging inconvenient truths. She became in her middle years a woman of a certain standing, not wealthy, never again achieving the degree of prosperity that she had known before Richelt's death, but established, respected within her particular sphere, autonomous in ways that mattered. Her tavern survived and eventually began to prosper again, though in a different register. The wealthy merchants who had once graced her establishment with their patronage came less frequently, yet they did not entirely disappear. Some of them, it seemed, valued discretion and honesty enough to maintain occasional contact with someone who had demonstrated both qualities. New merchants arrived, younger ones often, who had less investment in the old hierarchies, and who seemed to appreciate the tavern's reputation for honest dealing. It was during this period that news arrived of Claude's death. A body had been discovered some years after his disappearance, washed ashore near Marseille, in a state that made identification difficult but not impossible. The ship's crew, now questioned with greater care than had been exercised during the initial inquiry, confirmed that Claude had gone below decks and had not emerged when the vessel foundered. Whether he had been unable to reach the deck or whether he had chosen not to attempt the climb could not be determined. The body was given a proper burial by the local church, and she received word of this closure through a merchant who had connections in Marseille and who thought the information might be of interest to her. The news had arrived more than a decade after Claude's disappearance, and her response was one of quiet acceptance rather than emotional upheaval. She had mourned him in the months after his death was first suspected, and the actual confirmation of his death seemed to bring less additional grief than a kind of formal acknowledgement of what she had already accepted. She made arrangements for a mass to be said for his soul, as was customary, and she permitted herself a day of reduced activity at the tavern, during which she sat quietly and allowed herself to reflect on the particular form of partnership they had shared. When this reflection was complete, she returned to her work with the recognition that this chapter of her life had finally, definitively closed. It was also during these years that she began to take on a different kind of role within the community. Young women sometimes came to the tavern seeking her counsel, women facing the complicated circumstances of widowhood, women concerned about the character of men they were considering for marriage, women struggling to manage their affairs in a world that did not particularly wish them to do so. She did not advertise this role or position herself as someone offering guidance, yet word had spread through the particular mechanisms by which such knowledge travels that the tavern keeper was a woman who understood the world and who could be trusted with difficult matters. She found herself offering counsel that drew on her own experience, the practical wisdom that came from having navigated the particular vulnerabilities of a woman attempting to maintain autonomy and dignity in circumstances that were structured to make such maintenance difficult. She spoke honestly about the dangers of misplaced trust, the necessity of understanding the financial implications of various arrangements, the importance of maintaining some form of independence even within marriage or partnership. She also spoke, though more rarely, about the possibilities for genuine connection between people, about the ways that respect
and shared purpose could create bonds that were, if not passionate, at least stable and mutually sustaining. The young women who sought her counsel were sometimes disappointed by the absence of romance in her advice, by the insistence on practical calculation and caution. Yet many of them seemed to appreciate the clarity that she offered, the refusal to pretend that the world was more generous or more just than it actually was, the implicit acknowledgement that they possessed capacities for thought and action that were worth preserving. Some of them later returned to tell her of their outcomes, marriages that, while not passionate, were respectful and stable, businesses they had managed successfully, lives they had constructed according to their own judgment rather than according to convention. During these years, the investigation into Rochelle's death receded into memory, transformed into something close to legend. The younger generation of merchants knew the story only in vague terms. Some merchant had died under circumstances that remained somewhat unclear. There had been complications involving the church, certain arrangements had been disrupted. The emotional weight of the events had dissipated, had been absorbed into the city's ongoing narrative of commerce and change. Yet for her, the memory remained more immediate, more present. She did not dwell on it constantly, but it existed as a kind of permanent reference point, a moment in which she had made a choice about who she was and what she valued. A choice from which there was no subsequent retreat. Pierre had prospered, in his modest way, in his position with the cathedral. He had worked his way into positions of increasing responsibility, and by the time a decade had passed since the investigation, he had become one of the more capable administrators in the cathedral's apparatus. He still visited the tavern occasionally, though less frequently as his duties increased. When he came, he always took a table, ordered his wine, and remained for a brief period. They did not speak at length. Yet there existed between them a kind of understanding, a shared recognition of what they had undergone together, an acknowledgement that the bonds formed through confrontation with injustice were different in character from bonds formed through simple affection or proximity. One afternoon, Pierre came to the tavern carrying a small book, a record, he explained, of some of Rochelle's correspondence, preserved by the cathedral and recently compiled into a more accessible form. He left this with her, suggesting that she might find it of interest. She had read it that evening, sitting alone in her private quarters, and had found herself moved by the clarity of Rochelle's thinking, by his struggle with the compromises that came with commercial success, by his apparent sense that the world required not merely compliance with established rules, but active engagement with questions of justice. In reading Rochelle's words, she had come to understand something about herself that she had perhaps always sensed but had never fully articulated. She had been, for most of her life, a person who managed the world through attention and adaptation, rather than through direct confrontation. She had survived through observing carefully what was required and providing it, through understanding the implicit rules that governed the world and adhering to them. Her involvement with Rochelle's death had represented, in a way, a departure from this pattern, a moment in which she had chosen to act according to principle rather than according to survival. Yet she had also come to understand that this choice was not foreign to her nature, but rather an expression of something that had always been present beneath the surface. The tavern itself changed in character over the years, though the physical space remained essentially the same. The wooden tables became more scarred. The rushes on the floor required more frequent replacement. The walls gradually absorbed the accumulated smoke of years of use. Yet the space also became more comfortable, more worn into a particular kind of utility. Customers seemed to appreciate the establishment's lack of pretension, the honest quality of the drink and food, the sense that one could sit here without performing a particular role or maintaining a particular facade. She employed, by the time a decade had passed since Richelt's death, a small but capable staff. There was a young woman named Clemence who had come to her years earlier in circumstances similar to those that had first drawn her to provide shelter. Marguerite had offered her employment, had trained her carefully, had eventually come to trust her with the management of the tavern's daily operations. Clemence had repaid this trust with competent and consistent work, and had also, Marguerite had come to understand, begun to develop the same capacity for listening and observing that had characterized her own approach to the business. One day, observing Clemence's interaction with a patron, the way she asked careful questions that drew out his concerns while maintaining professional distance, she had recognized something like her own younger self developing in this young woman. She had taken Clemence aside and had, with some care, attempted to articulate what she had learned about the particular skills that a tavern keeper required, the ways that attention and discretion could be sources of genuine power. Clemence had listened with the kind of seriousness that suggested she understood that she was being offered something valuable, something that went beyond the simple instruction required to manage the tavern's operations. By her middle years, she had also begun to understand the particular solitude that came from her choice to maintain principle over comfort. She had sacrificed certain forms of connection, the intimacy that came from being part of the merchant community, the particular sense of belonging that came from shared interests and shared compromises with established power. In exchange, she had gained a different kind of autonomy, a different kind of respect. Yet this was an exchange that carried costs that were real and ongoing. There were evenings when she sat alone in her private quarters and felt the weight of her own isolation, the absence of someone with whom she could truly share her burdens, the particular loneliness of being a woman who had chosen to act according to her own judgment, rather than according to what the world had prescribed for her. Yet there were also evenings when she would stand in her tavern during the quiet hours before opening, observing the particular quality of light that fell through the windows, the potential latent in the empty space waiting to be filled with human presence and conversation. In these moments, she felt a kind of peace, not the absence of longing or regret, but rather an acceptance of the particular life she had constructed, with all its limitations and all its possibilities. She had not achieved wealth or power or social prominence, yet she had achieved something that she came to value as much as, or perhaps more than, these conventional measures of success. She had achieved integrity. The years continued to move forward with the inevitable progress of seasons and aging. Her hair, which had been dark in her youth, gradually grayed. Her hands, which had always been her primary instrument of work, developed the particular knots and thicknesses that come with age and constant labor. She moved more slowly, felt the weight of work more acutely, began to understand that her body would not sustain the same level of activity forever. Yet she did not diminish her engagement with the tavern. Instead, she modulated it. She worked less in the physically demanding aspects of the business and invested more time in management, in teaching Clemence, in the particular work of understanding and advising the patrons who came to her establishment. It was sometime in what she understood to be her middle 30s when she began to make preparations for a future in which the tavern would continue without her daily presence. She had no children who might inherit the business. She had no close relatives with whom to share the burden. Yet she recognized that if she wished the tavern to continue, and she increasingly understood that this mattered to her, that this small establishment had become something worth preserving, she would need to ensure that there was someone capable of managing it after she could no longer do so herself.
Her attention turned increasingly toward Clemens, and she began to make provisions that were both practical and legal to ensure that Clemens would have the capacity to manage the tavern if circumstances required it. She consulted with lawyers regarding the precise form that such provisions should take, and she established arrangements that would allow Clemens to assume control of the tavern without requiring the permission of authorities who might be inclined to question the appropriateness of a young woman of her station managing such an establishment. These preparations were conducted quietly and without fanfare, but they represented, in their own way, an act of faith, a recognition that the particular work she had undertaken had value and worth enough to be worth preserving beyond her own lifetime. The autumn had arrived with its particular quality of gentle decline, the leaves turning in the trees along the riverbank, the light taking on the particular clarity that comes only in the later months of the year, when the sun's angle has shifted and the air has begun to carry the first suggestions of cold. She stood near the tavern's window in the hour before opening, watching the light change across the water, observing the way the reflections of the city shifted and reformed as the current moved beneath the surface. This was a moment she had come to cherish in recent years, a time of solitude before the work of the day required her attention, a time when she could simply be present to the world, without the necessity of performing any particular role or maintaining any particular facade. Her hands rested on the worn wooden counter, and she was aware of them in a way that she had not been when she was younger. Aware of their age, their particular character, the particular story they contained. These hands had worked in her father's dyer's workshop, had managed the complex transactions of a tavern kitchen, had sheltered a young man, when doing so, carried risks she was only beginning to understand, had carefully preserved documents that would become evidence, had held a cup of wine and served it to patrons whose names she could no longer recall with perfect accuracy. The work that hands did accumulated, she understood, in ways that went beyond the purely physical. The work shaped not only the world around them, but the person to whom they belonged. She became aware, gradually, of someone entering the tavern, a sound of the door opening, the particular quality of movement that suggested a patron arriving earlier than was typical. She turned from the window and found herself observing a young man whom she did not immediately recognize. He was perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in the manner of a minor merchant, or perhaps a successful artisan, carrying himself with a kind of confidence that came from having never encountered serious obstacles in the world. As he approached her, she began to recognize in his features something familiar, a particular shape of the face, a quality of the eyes. "You are the tavern keeper," he said. It was not a question, but rather a statement of recognition, delivered with the kind of certainty that came from having heard her described by someone else. "My father has spoken of you many times. I am Antoine Richelt." The recognition arrived slowly, but it arrived nonetheless. This was the son of Gerard Richelt, not the son who had entered the clergy and who had disappointed his father by refusing to engage in commerce, but rather, it seemed, a younger son, or perhaps a son from a second marriage, or from some arrangement that she had not been aware of in the years when Richelt had been a regular patron of her tavern. The resemblance to his father was apparent, now that she knew to look for it, though it was tempered by youth and by something that might have been a different disposition toward the world.
"I did not know that Monsieur Richelt had a son of your age," she said carefully. Her mind was working rapidly, attempting to place this young man in the narrative of Richelt's life as she had understood it, attempting to understand what he might be doing here, what his arrival might signify. "He did not speak of me to many people," Antoine responded.
There was in his tone something that suggested both understanding and a kind of resigned acceptance of this fact. "My mother was not his wife. The circumstances of my birth were such that discretion seemed the most appropriate course. But he provided for me, ensured that I was educated, and before his death, he explained to me certain matters regarding his business and his life." She gestured for him to sit, and she brought him wine. Not the cheaper ale that most patrons drank, but the better wine that she reserved for particular occasions. As she set the cup before him, she found herself studying his face, attempting to read his purpose, attempting to understand what had brought him to her tavern on this particular afternoon. "My father spoke of you with considerable respect," Antoine said, after he had tasted the wine. "He told me that you possessed integrity, that you could be trusted with matters of consequence, that you had chosen principle over comfort in ways that were rare and valuable. I have come to you because I find myself confronting a situation in which integrity seems to be required, and I thought that perhaps you might offer counsel or perspective." The request was direct, delivered without the particular circumlocution that characterized much of the communication she engaged in at the tavern. She found herself appreciating this directness, even as she remained cautious about what was being asked of her. She had, by this point in her life, learned something about the particular ways that people tested each other, about the mechanisms through which trust was established and verified. "What is the nature of the situation?" she asked. Antoine explained, in measured tones, that he had been approached by certain parties regarding the possibility of engaging in business arrangements that would be profitable, but that would involve a degree of deception regarding the quality and origins of the goods being traded. The profit margins were significant, the risk of detection was apparently minimal, and there were people of considerable standing who were willing to facilitate the arrangements. Yet something in his conversation with his father, something that had been partially explicit and partially implicit in their discussions of commerce and integrity, had created in him a sense of unease about the proposition. "I am young," Antoine said. "I have not yet established my reputation or my fortune. To refuse this opportunity might mean accepting a slower path to prosperity, accepting positions of less authority than my ambitions suggest I might achieve. Yet my father's life, and particularly the manner in which his life concluded, created in me a certain understanding that the choices one makes accumulate, that they create patterns that shape one's entire existence." She listened to this account with the kind of attention that she had learned to bring to matters of genuine consequence. She was aware, as Antoine spoke, that he was offering her a kind of compliment, an acknowledgement that her own choices had been visible to his father, and that his father had valued those choices enough to communicate them to his son as something worth considering. She was also aware that she was being asked, implicitly, to help him navigate a decision that would have real consequences for his future. When he had finished, she was silent for a moment before responding. "Your father was a man who understood that choices made in pursuit of profit could gradually erode one's capacity to recognize other kinds of value in the world. I do not know whether he was ultimately successful in living according to this understanding. I only know that he struggled with it, and that he seemed to value the attempt.
"But what would you counsel?" Antoine pressed. "Should I refuse this opportunity? Should I accept it and attempt to manage the ethical complications? Should I do something else entirely?" She found herself hesitating before responding, because she recognized that whatever she said would carry weight, that a young man of her acquaintance, connected to someone who had mattered to her, was asking her to participate in a significant decision about the shape of his future. She was aware of the responsibility that this created, aware that any counsel she offered would be, in some sense, a kind of action, with consequences that would ripple into a future she would not fully inhabit. "I cannot advise you regarding the specific choice," she said finally. "Such choices are yours alone to make, and they must rest on your own judgment and your own understanding of what matters to you. But I can tell you that in my experience, the easier path is often not the path that allows one to sleep peacefully or to regard oneself with genuine respect. The path that requires sacrifice, that demands integrity, even when integrity has a cost, that path is more difficult. But it is also the path that allows one to build a life that belongs entirely to oneself, rather than a life that is built on compromises one gradually stops questioning." Antoine listened to this counsel with the seriousness of someone who understood that he was being offered something genuine, something drawn from experience, rather than from abstract principle. He finished his wine, and he rose to depart. At the threshold, he turned back and said, "My father left documents regarding his business and his concerns. I have inherited these documents, and I have been considering what to do with them. Your counsel suggests that perhaps I should ensure they are preserved, and that they might be consulted by future generations who might benefit from understanding what occurred." After he had departed, she returned to the counter and to her contemplation of the light on the water. The encounter had been brief, yet it had carried a particular kind of significance. She had been offered, in a sense, a view of how her own choices had rippled outward, how her decision to act on principle regarding Richel's death had become part of the inheritance he had left to his son, how her own character had been observed and had influenced someone else's understanding of how the world might be navigated. As the afternoon progressed and the tavern gradually filled with patrons, she moved through her work with the practiced efficiency that came from decades of such labor. She served ale and wine. She attended to the kitchen. She managed the small disputes and negotiations that emerged from the interaction of various personalities and interests. Yet a portion of her attention remained with the encounter that had occurred, with the young man who had come seeking counsel, with the reminder that consequences extended outward in directions one could not fully predict or control. It was in the late evening, after most patrons had departed, and she had begun the work of closing the tavern, that she stood once more at the window and observed the particular quality of light that remained after sunset, a kind of twilight that seemed to exist between day and night, between presence and absence. The river was barely visible now, but she could hear it in the darkness, the sound of water moving, the particular murmur that it carried as it continued its eternal work of transport and transformation. She thought, in this moment, about the particular shape that her life had taken, the trajectory from the dyer's daughter to tavern keeper, the detours and complications that had emerged along the way, the choices that had seemed insignificant at the moment of making them, but which had accumulated into something that resembled a coherent narrative. She thought about Richel, who had moved through her tavern and who had, through his choices and his death, created the occasion for her to act according to principle rather than according to survival. She thought about Pierre, who had found refuge and who had ultimately found a path toward security and dignity. She thought about the young women who had come to her seeking counsel, and who had carried forward the particular kind of wisdom that came from having survived difficult circumstances with integrity intact.
She thought as well about the future, about what would come after she could no longer manage the tavern, about what Clemence would make of the establishment that had been left to her, about what other people would move through these spaces and create their own narratives and their own meanings. She understood that she would not be present for much of this future, that the world would continue to move forward in ways that her consciousness would not inhabit. Yet she was aware that the choices she had made, the care she had taken, the principles she had attempted to embody, these things had a kind of permanence that went beyond her own presence or absence. The city beyond the tavern's walls continued its work. The river moved, merchants conducted business, people were born and aged and died. The world proceeded according to its own logic and necessity. Within this larger world, her tavern was a small space, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. Yet it was also a space where a particular kind of integrity had been maintained, where people could come and be treated with genuine respect, where conversations of consequence could occur without ostentation or pretense. In the end, she understood this was enough, this small space, this particular dedication to truth and care. This was a meaningful contribution to the world, even if the world at large would not particularly acknowledge or celebrate it. She secured the tavern for the night and retired to her private quarters, where a small fire burned against the autumn chill. The light from the fire played across the walls, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move as though alive. She settled into her chair and allowed herself to rest, aware of her body's age, aware of the particular peace that came from a day of labor completed, aware of the particular contentment that came from having lived according to her own judgment and her own understanding of what was right. Outside, the autumn evening deepened into night, and the city gradually settled into sleep. The river continued its patient work, indifferent to human concerns, carrying everything that the world placed upon it toward some distant conclusion. And within her small tavern, now dark and quiet, the accumulated weight of years and choices and principle rested like a foundation, solid, real, and enduring in ways that neither she nor anyone else could fully predict or control. The future remained open, unknowable, full of possibility. Yet it would be a future that had been shaped, in small but significant ways, by the particular integrity with which she had lived, by the choices she had made, when choosing according to principle seemed less safe than choosing according to convenience. And that, she understood, was the only legacy anyone could truly offer, not power, not wealth, not recognition, but the simple fact of having lived truthfully in a world that often rewarded deception.